I remember you telling us a story once about how you met a guy in Israel. I think it was in Israel.
It was.
And he was in the bar or something.
It was in a hookah bar.
Okay, yeah. And he stopped like some like war or something.
I'm curious to know how much you remember of this.
Yeah, a little bit.
Did he tell us in international
I think I told it was about Vanunu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You bought him a drink. And
do you mind
tell him
giving us the
Oh
breakdown
man, how much of this story? How much time do you have here?
Well,
you'll edit
we
this
like to
stuff
keep
later.
it under an hour.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, 25 minutes.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
So okay, again, I'm a history teacher for those of you out there in podcast world. So I drone on this. So I apologize. Here's what you need to know. Israel in the 70s had a clandestine nuclear weapons program, meaning it was not announced to the world. And so so it was a secret nuclear weapons, secret WMDs is what Israel has, right?
Okay.
And there was a major war in Israel in 1973. It was called the Yom Kippur War, and 3 neighboring Arab countries invaded Israel at the same time, and it didn't look good for Israel there for a little bit. And so the Prime Minister of Israel decided to say, well, let's put this nuclear weapon to use. Let's go bomb Cairo. And so the discussion was, should we bomb Cairo with a nuclear weapon, which would have had an insane impact. You talk about hypothetical history. It would have been insane. But cooler heads prevailed, and they decided not to do it. But there was a guy who was working on the nuclear program, and his name was Mordechai Vanunu. And he saw this situation. He was like, oh man, we were going to launch a nuclear. We were going to drop a bomb on somebody. This isn't right. Shouldn't be secret. So he's going to blow the whistle. He's going to be a whistleblower. So he goes on vacation to London, walks into the Guardian's news office, and says, hey, here's the deal. Blows the whistle on the whole thing. Israel says he's a spy. Probably the same way Americans kind of look at Edward Snowden. Mm-hmm. It's a similar thing. Okay. But now he's got freaking asylum and they can't get him. And so Israel sends out their secret, the Mossad, famous, the Mossad, and they trick him and they get him and they put him in jail, and he gets a 30-year prison sentence in Israel for espionage.
Jeez. Yeah.
And so he gets out in 2004, right around the time that I'm moving to Israel, because that's 30 years, but the Israelis still didn't trust him because they thought he had state secrets, so they told him you can't leave the country. But his 30 years in prison, a lot of that was spent in solitary confinement because, again, the Israelis didn't trust that he wasn't going to give secret, state secrets away. And so Mordechai Vanunu, a Jewish Israeli, becomes very publicly anti-Semitic, saying, I hate Israel and I hate the Jewish people because they're doing all this stuff to me. He refuses to speak Hebrew. He's only going to speak English, and he learns Arabic. And when he gets out of prison, he goes and lives in an Arab section of East Jerusalem because he doesn't want to be around any Israelis. But that's technically still in Israel, and so that's where he's hanging out. Okay. That's where I ran into him at this bar, and he walked in, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, it's Vanunu. He's a big deal. If Edward Snowden walked into the Applebee's, you guys go, hey, eat out after these podcasts, you'd be like, oh my God, that's Edward Snowden, right? Yeah. It was the same thing. So I just went up and chatted with him, and he was pretty arrogant and didn't look like he wanted to speak with me very much. And I bought him some tea and then eventually went back and sat down. So it turned out to be more of a cool story than the lead up and everything to it. Talking to him was kind of anticlimactic.
Yeah,
but he's literally a dude in history.
Yeah, but you didn't know who. You didn't know.
Not
who
when
he
he walked in. Yeah, okay. The guys I was sitting with was like, "That's this guy," and I didn't know him. And they gave me the whole story. Mm-hmm. So it was. Yeah, there you go. Blast from the past. So I'm sure Vanunu would recognize me if you chatted him up. No, there's no way. Yeah. So.
That's crazy though.
And then you had a friend who was not a fan of you talking to him, right?
I'm sure Dan will end up not listening to this podcast so I can speak about Dan. Dan was just a buddy of mine. He was an American, but he was Jewish, and so he made Aliyah. He'd become an Israeli citizen. Mm-hmm. And I went back. We had a tennis date. We'd play tennis with each other every Tuesday. And so I went to meet up at the health club. We were getting ready to play, and I said, guess what, dude? Guess who I met? And I told him, and he was pissed. And so, and I couldn't understand why he was so angry, but now he was a very nationalistic Israeli, and this guy was a traitor in his mind. And so he wasn't very happy that I was speaking so, well, he's saying it was cool to have met this dude. And so we were playing tennis, and it was probably the most intense tennis game I had ever had in my entire life. And so, and as the story goes, I hit the best drop shot I've ever hit in my life. And Dan laid out to get it, French Open style, completely into the splits, and he ended up tearing his hamstring from his bone. So I had to get him to the hospital after that. So I don't know. You probably don't want to put explicit tabs on this pod, right? So I won't use the words, but there were a lot of expletives flying very loudly when Dan tore his hamstring from his leg. So
Jeez, yeah.
about 6 months afterwards, I told him it's because of that anger you're holding towards Vanunu, and he didn't even appreciate that joke 6 months later. So
Vanunu, that's funny.
Vanunu.
Yeah.